such a thing? Does it well and truly exist? Did it ever exist in the first place? Whatever the answer is, the debate amongst experts continues still. No, I'm not talking about Bigfoot, Dracula's castle, or the king.
You better watch your mouth, son, before your mama smacks you.
Yes, I'm talking about what is horror's greatest year ever. It's a happy debate that I constantly find myself in with myself. 79, 31, 79, 31, 79, 31, 79, 31, 79, 31, 79, 31, 2000. What? Ginger snaps? So I thought, let's open the argument up to all of you out there. Let's settle the score once and for all. What was horror's greatest year in film ever? Every now and then, at predetermined intervals, I will nominate one year that I believe is a good candidate for horror's greatest ever year. In order to keep things interesting and consistent, we will need a simple criteria. I suggest the following. Each nominated year needs to have at least 5 major box office successes, 2 highly original, if not underrated horror films, and definitely 2 seminal classics. Now by classics, I don't necessarily mean the old black and white classics, but a classic horror movie that gave horror fans something new, that pushed the boundaries of horror and maybe redefined the genre a little bit, something that caused a stir in the world of horror, something that stands or has stood the test of time. Now this goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Please feel free to suggest any further criteria you believe needs to be added, and of course, go ahead and nominate what you believe is horror's greatest ever year. So to kick things off, my first nomination for horror's greatest ever year is 2016. I know some of you might feel that horror's greatest year should be like way further back. Why? Because, well, everything was better in the good old days, right?
Hey, you youngsters learn nothing. Back in my day, we used to have real horror that scared the out of me.
Now sure, 2016 did have its fair share of horror bombs. Cell, The Forest, Blair Witch. Unfortunately, these films ended up promising more than they eventually delivered. 2016 was a pretty notable and remarkable year, and not just because Pokemon Go finally hit the streets to the bemusements of adults all over the world. Adults like myself. And not just because Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson was voted as sexiest man alive. I have nothing to do with that, I promise you. And not just because 6,755 postal workers were attacked by little dogs. Oof. And not just because some people decided to dress up as clowns and stare at you while you were waiting for the bus. To be honest, that stuff actually freaked me out a little bit. But 2016 was also a remarkable year for film and the box office in general, with massive releases like Rogue One, Deadpool and Suicide Squad all hitting the screens. But horror was not going to be left out of the game, and also smashed onto the box office with their bloody bats swinging. One such success was the psychological horror The Boy. Not one of my personal favorites, but it was creepy and it certainly did bring home the bacon. The supernatural horror Lights Out also proved to be a surprise hit, and surprisingly good, if not slightly forgettable. And let's not forget the $118 million grossing hit, and possible inspiration behind some of those pesky clown sightings, The Purge, election year. Where the hell is Frank Grillo when you need him, huh? 2016 also saw the much welcomed return of a horror film that would rise to the very top echelons of the box office and indeed become the highest earning horror film of that year with a massive gross of $320 million. Ka-ching! Yes, I'm sure that most of you probably know which horror movie I'm talking about. You know, that one that was partly based on true events, and more importantly, was a very worthy sequel, The Conjuring 2. And probably one of the most anticipated, if not coolest films of 2016 was M.night Shyamalan's spectacular return to form in the stellar psychological horror film Split. And I've also got to mention another film, and not just because it was a big hit, but also because it proved to be one of my favorite horror films of 2016, Mike Flanagan's Ouija Origin of Evil, which I speak about in more detail in my episode of Superior Sequels, so go and check that out if you're interested. Now, there were further hits in 2016, but just mentioning those 6, you kind of get a good picture of what a big year it was for the horror genre. But wait, why does everything have to revolve around money and the box office? We're not money-grabbing producers and investors. That's all popcorn fluff. What about the meat? What about those movies that maybe people like you and me saw, but the masses out there didn't hear about, or were just too scared to go out and see? That's right. I'm talking about horror's rough and underrated diamonds.
I am talking about those films for us connoisseurs of blood.
So we said at least 2 underrated horror gems. You know, the kinds of films that maybe didn't find the audience numbers that they deserved. Or maybe they still will. I certainly hope so. Now, I'm not just going to bring you 2, but 4 really special horror gems. These were films that got good reviews from critics, but also, in some cases at least, polarized audiences. They were the kinds of films that I feel, and this is more important actually, they try to dig a little bit deeper. They try to go a little bit darker than some of their more famous, more well-known, glitzier Hollywood brethren. Now, I mentioned Mike Flanagan earlier. He didn't just make 1, but 2 horror gems in 2016. Hush wasn't quite the big hit that Ouija Origin of Evil was, but it did prove to be a disturbing horror film that revisited the slasher genre, but in a more contemporary and original way. And hey, Stephen King, as well as The Exorcist director William Friedkin, both loved it. Who am I to argue? Now, another classy but sadly underrated horror gem of 2016 was Autopsy of Jane Doe. Now, how this film did not receive a bigger audience, I simply do not know. It was directed by one of my favorite filmmakers, Norwegian director Andre Øvredal, who made one of my favorite films of all time, Troll Hunter, which I do an early review on. So if you got a little bit of time, go and check that episode out. Jane Doe was a well-written, well-acted, creepy, and sophisticated horror pick that'll make you reconsider that career as a coroner. What do you mean you've never wanted to be a coroner? Everyone wants to be a coroner. Now, the next film is one that I can see why audiences chose to stay away from. Because let me tell you, it is a shocking watch. The Eyes of My Mother is a black and white chiller that often feels like a long nightmare. Too surreal, too abstract, and too disturbing. It absolutely polarized audiences, and to be honest with you, I can see why. But this film about the aftermath a daughter and her father experiences after a mysterious stranger brutally murders her mother is violent, horrific, but it's also daring. It's the kind of film that I feel keeps horror honest and keeps the genre from stepping too far into that happy slashy party box of mass consumption. But my favorite underrated horror movie of 2016 has to be A Dark Song. Which I speak about in my episode of Review Randomonium. This film is gripping, it's original, it's somber, it's heartfelt, and it's terrifying. Certainly easier viewing than The Eyes of My Mother, but just as haunting, maybe even more so. And it's definitely a film that if you haven't seen, I would be happy to recommend. If you like good acting, great writing, and a layered but simple story, then this film about a desperately grieving mother trying to communicate with her deceased child is for you. And also a big, if not underrated plus of 2016. Now, if I have still not convinced you on 2016, then my last attempt has to be these 2 seminal films, or at least I thought that they were seminal. Let's see if you agree. The first film is the South Korean zombie apocalypse film Train to Busan. What? Yeah, I said zombie apocalypse film. What's so weird about that? But this is by no means that lumbering B-grade zombie apocalypse film. Not at all. Train to Busan cleverly takes a family drama and throws it into the middle of a zombie pandemic. The film takes place mainly on a high-speed train as families desperately try and escape an escalating zombie outbreak. It takes the typical tropes of zombie horror and turns it on its head. And it also goes to show what good and original writing can do to elevate even the most stale premise. And there must be a very good reason why so many people outside of Korea flocked to watch this foreign language film. Now, the next film was more than just a box office hit, but also, I believe, made us think about horror in a slightly different way. Even if it was just up until the rather lackluster sequel. That's my opinion. Don't Breathe isn't arty, it isn't deep, but it goes at breakneck speed. And set mostly in a creaky old house where an even creakier old blind man lurks its shadowy hallways, it's a film that is tense and claustrophobic, and also filled with plot twists that surprise but never patronize its audience. Now, if Don't Breathe didn't redefine our conceptions of horror, it certainly redefined the notion of how dangerous an old blind dude could be. Don't Breathe also marked a slight rebirth in the psychological horror film, giving us a villain that was fascinating, charismatic, and at times even more interesting than the protagonist, but Speaking about the protagonist, the film also gives us a very strong female lead. It's a film that dared not to rely on ghosts, vampires, and zombies, but instead relied on tight pacing, great cinematography, and one of the craziest twists hiding in the cellar we've ever seen. So, have I convinced you that 2016 was the greatest year in horror? No? That's cool. Well, let me know which year I should be talking about. There is still a lot left to ponder. As for me, I'm going to be watching this hairy critter. Brilliant B grade? Maybe. Be sure that I will let you know, fan of horror. On that note, I wish you all a wonderful week. Stay safe, stay happy, and stay horror. Cheers, everyone. Well, let me know which year I should be talking about. There is a lot left to ponder. As for me, I think I'm going to be watching this. Man.